Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar. This has been hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name is Katie Bryan, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Manager for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on reducing lamb losses. Our presenter this evening is Emily Gascoigne, a sheep vet with Synergy Farm Health. Emily has a special interest in sheep production, flock health planning, and reducing production losses in sheep units. So without further delay, I will hand you over to Emily for tonight's presentation on reducing lamb losses.
Thank you, Katie, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone that's given up their time this evening. As Katie said, I'm working with commercial flocks in Dorset and across the southwest, and tonight is essentially going to be a summary of something that we've been targeting in practice. Just to give you a little bit of an outline of what to expect this evening, it's not going to be an exhaustive list of all the causes of lamb mortality, and it certainly won't be any flock-specific advice. But what I'm hoping to cover for both the vets and farmers in the audience is how to start off with investigating lamb mortality in the very beginning, and essentially a framework which can help you perhaps focus on key issues for your farm and develop sort of flock-specific strategies which can potentially have a benefit for your losses and production overall. And really with an emphasis on preventative approach where possible rather than reactive. For any of the Twitteraholics in the audience, the hashtag #EveryLambCounts is something that myself and other sheep vets and advisors have been using. So if anybody is on Twitter tonight and has any pertinent or take-home messages they want to tweet about, that's the hashtag. So just to sort of start off with, and I'm conscious that the flocks in the audience will have a varying spectrum of data across them, when investigating lamb mortality, ultimately we need to start with the headline facts and break it down a little bit. So I'm confident that most flocks in the audience or that we're working with will be able to work out scanning to sale losses. So whether that's the difference between their scanner card and actually the number of lambs leaving their farm or being retained as replacements, that headline loss figure, scanning to sale, is a tangible figure that should be relatively accessible for all flocks, and it can prompt the beginning of the discussion. But largely, for further investigation or more targeted resource, targeting of resources, we need to get to more finite periods of losses. And the ones that we'll be considering this evening are from scanning to birth, from birth to turnout in 48 hours old, depending on the system type, and from turnout till the end of the productive year. Once we've got that information, we sort of want to have a rough idea of where we might expect those losses to happen. And if you look at this pie chart at the bottom, this was some work by HCC, this is showing essentially of all the lambs that we're losing over that productive year, where are they being lost? And largely this data found that between scanning and the end of that 48-hour window, we're losing 30 plus 49%. So over 3/4 of total losses are happening before these lambs are leaving the lambing shed or exiting those 48 hours. So that's what we can classically expect from the vast majority of sheep flocks. So the neonatal window and the pre-neonatal window are especially vulnerable. And when we look at this, is taken from one of the AHDB manuals, and pick the farm type which is more similar to what you're working with, and these are based on 100 ewes tubs. We can see where we're likely to experience those losses, and these are good starting targets or benchmarks for flock to compare themselves to. So if we look at that lowland flock, from scanning to birth, which will include your born deads, 6%, from birth to turnout, which is that really risky 48-hour window, a further 6%. And then really the vast majority of flocks should be on the home straight post-turnout, although we do know there are key diseases, pulpy-kidney, etc., which can really skew that image. So if we've got those crude targets in our mind, we can sort of start to decipher where your flock or where the flocks you're responsible for fit in that picture. Now, when starting to investigate this in the first instance, the common question can be, well, where do I start? If I look at last year, where do I start? Now, most flocks will have that scanning to sale figure, but the intricacies of whether you're using lambs in the green arrow or the blue arrow, that can be harder without lots of recording in the lambing shed. So what I start off with getting some of my flocks to doing is taking an end of lambing figure, whether that's lambs leaving your lambing shed, whether that's lambs being ear tagged or recorded, or even if it's as crude as lambs making it to first drench. Actually, that's a midway point, which might just prompt or direct your initial investigation. Now, when talking about any aspect of flock health, it's really important that we have an understanding of the cost of the issue, because if we want to implement changes on farm, if we want to invest in this health issue on farm, we really have to have an understanding of what it's costing us, because actually is there a cost benefit to doing that. So when we consider the total cost of lamb production is made up of our variable costs, so the costs that increase relative to the amount we're producing, versus those fixed costs, so the costs that happen irrespective of what we're producing, and then take those figures or those parameters and look at commercial sheep flocks. This is just stock take data, which is available on the AHDB website. But if we look at the top third versus the average or bottom third of flocks, if you look at that blue box at the bottom, that's the gross margin of those flocks. So that's considering the variable costs. And we can see that the big thing that varies between the top and the bottom third is, well, feed cost is going to be a really big driver of that. But ultimately, we're looking at the bottom line, which is this next slide, and again goes to the bottom of that blue box, and the full investment, the net margin there. We've obviously got some negative figures, and that's going to take into consideration those fixed costs. Now, those fixed costs are going to be big drivers of the margin of those lambs, and ultimately we want to spread those fixed cost of units across as many lambs as possible, and ultimately achieve the potential of those variable costs that we've inputted. So it's about achieving potential that we've already invested in and reducing those losses as a consequence. And I think one thing that we've started talking to a lot of our flocks about is actually, if you think about the sheep production year, where are you spending the most money? So from essentially recruitment of a ewe into your flock all the way through to the lambs hopefully leaving the farm at the other end, actually, where are you spending and where are you recuperating your investment? And actually, from our experience in the data, it suggests that you're spending the big investment phase is happening before that water bag even erupts from those ewes. And essentially the period from there on out is realising those investments and optimising the number of lambs we've actually got leaving farm. So this expenditure has largely already happened for the cost of production of these lambs. And this is something that we've been trying to have as a dialogue with our sheep farmers in practice. So this is a very simple print screen of an Excel calculator that we've generated in practice, and we did some farmer meetings where we basically got them in groups and got them to debate, the cost of replacement ewes and the cost of tups, and essentially worked those inputs across a ewe over a lifetime, for example, over a replacement cost or a per year basis, and then ultimately divided it by the scanning figure. So for every scanned lamb, actually what had we invested? Now, this £17 figure that's at the top, that's just one example of one flock, and that was a flock that was scanning at 1.85, but we would have flocks that would be less than that, where their inputs were lower. But equally, we would have flocks whose, and this is just on variable costs, would be higher than that as well. And the next slide just shows, I hope you can all see it quite clearly, this is just playing around with some numbers, but that cost of production, that's the inputs. That's assuming that we get all our lambs to a position where we can sell them. But actually, we know that that's not the reality on farm. And for this imaginary flock at £17 variable input per ewe before those water bags erupt, at 800 ewes scanning 1.85, we can see what the scanner man has told them the potential lambs they might have off farm. And essentially, if we've spread that input across those lambs, that's what it will cost. But by the time we take away 15% of those lambs, what we actually have to do is inflate the costs of the lambs that are left behind, which is the £20.18 you see on the other side. So those lambs that end up in the dead lamb bin, they really do have a cost. but actually they're just adding it to their flock mates who do leave the farm. So this can be a very expensive issue. And on this model, this example of a farm, you can see that very easily we've accumulated £4,000 of sheer loss that needs spreading across other lambs. And this is just a picture that one of my colleagues took. These are lambs from a ewe that had been scanned the week before, just to show how tiny these lambs are when we're scanning them. So you might be a flock or a vet in the audience that thinking, actually, where do I start? I've got my scanning to sale losses, but I want to decipher, I want to drill down a little bit more. But perhaps I don't have EID technology, perhaps my lambing is frantic, perhaps I'm an outdoor lambing flock, and actually whatever I'm doing, it needs to be quick and flexible. And my advice would be to everyone in the audience is keep it really simple and really, really clear, because if it's complicated, no one's going to have time to, the data is going to be missing or the quality is going to be compromised. So keep it really simple. And it might be in the first instance that what you record is wet deads versus dry deads. So to give you an idea of lambs that have perhaps had issues with lambing versus lambs that probably have been licked off by mum and then have gone on to have an issue, that might be a really good start. Well, these are two examples of my flocks that had perhaps more intricate, and they were just guessing what the suspected causes of deaths were there. So a simple tally chart is perhaps all that you need to start off with. The reason for those midpoints, these are some real flocks of mine, A, B, C, D, and these are real examples of the losses on those farms. I just wanted to put these here as examples of why that midpoint figure, however crude it is potentially a really valuable halfway house to just deciphering where those losses are. We start off by looking at flocks C and D in these examples. They're both, one's just under 18% lamb loss and one's just, let's call them 18% lamb loss. But the blue component of the bar is the lambs that have been lost between scanning and that turnout figure. So we know from earlier, we would anticipate that that is at least 75%, if not 80% of their total losses on farm. And if I had started having a discussion with flock C or D, I might talk about the fact they've got their 18% mortality, and we might want to focus or drill down on that. But actually, you can see by looking at flock C's data that actually their total mortality in the neonatal and prenatal window is just over 10%. So it's probably roughly on target for those benchmarks we were talking about earlier. But actually, they're losing more than that post-turnout. And that is going to be an example where I can focus those conversations. And perhaps that's not a flock where it's prudent to labour the points about lambing shed, but actually maybe it's nematovirus control or clostridial vaccination that's more prudent for those flocks. And the same applies to flocks A and B. Whilst I acknowledge that their overall lamb mortality is below target, actually flock A is having their lambs are being challenged post-turnout, and it might be a very simple management or pasture rotation or vaccination solution to driving those losses down even further, so that those post-turnout losses are back down at 2%. Now, all that data on that slide has essentially been produced either from first drench, turning out of the lambing shed data. It's very tangible, tactile data, and it's just going to start focusing those discussions that you and your veterinary advisor can have. So a good place to start. Now, as advisors and as shepherds, we've got to be realistic about what what data we're going to be able to generate on farm, and as advisors, what we're going to be able to get off farm. Because some producers and some in the audience will have ewe-level data. They will have EID, and they'll be able to give essentially a clinical history of what's happening to lambs, and that's fantastic when that's available. But sometimes with outdoor lambing flocks, we might be working at group-level data. So a number of ewes with a number of scanned lambs went into that field, and that actually may be all we have to work with in the first instance. So we need to be pragmatic about that. But I can't stress enough the necessity for that flock-specific data. And those bar charts in the slide above, the advice I would be giving those flocks is going to be very, very different, and hence the need for that data. Now, why do lambs die? I'm sure that's a topic you've all thought about at some point, and this was some summary of some work from HCC, and the reasons on this is a lowland spring lambing flock, and you can see there's a whole variety of causes there, probably you're all familiar with. Note that abortion or stillbirth is a significant proportion of that bar chart, and the impact of particularly infectious abortion should not be underestimated, both on frank abortion and also lamb mortality going forward. It's going to be a significant source of weak lambs. But that's very generic and it's not very flock specific, and the abortion discussion versus the hypothermia discussion, while they may have common risk factors, actually we need to be drilling down on that more for our farms. So when you're either preparing for an investigation or you're an advisor and you're looking at an investigation, again, that need for flock-specific data, but having an understanding of the farm is really, really important. Now, that can be challenging sometimes if you're not routinely on farm, but it's really worth having a thorough understanding of what the process of production on that farm is. For example, if it's an open flock and a flock is buying in sheep, there's potentially risks of other diseases such as border disease or chlamydia, which may interfere with the dynamic of lamb mortality. So taking time to have a full history, and particularly of nutritional inputs, etc., is important. But I think it's really important for us when we're working together to be clear about what we're trying to achieve with our investigation. So the most common type that I would have would almost be a retrospective investigation. So catch up post-lambing, where did we lose lambs, what was our total losses, and that's a really, really good place to start. And if that's the point that you're coming to this discussion at, that really is a really good place to start. But the second option, sorry, that first option doesn't give a lot of opportunity for sample collection or further investigation, and that can be a limitation of that type. The second option is that we do it in the thick of the moment. Now, sometimes that's reactive, so we've had a real issue with lamb mortality and we need to investigate it now and react to that. Or the other option is sort of a real-time but a proactive investigation. Now, whether that's farmers doing post-mortems on neonatal lambs or farmers once a week, once a fortnight, dropping in a bag of lambs to their vet and getting them post-mortem, and this trickle accumulation of data throughout lambing, that's going to enable subtle changes in practice, which might influence lamb mortality there and then, but it's going to build up this cross-lambing picture of what's actually happening. Often when we do reactive investigations, we just look at the lambs that have died over the last 24, 48 hours. And it's very specific and doesn't give us that full breadth of lambing experience. So we've been involved with training farmers to do neonatal lamb post-mortems and really can't advocate enough real-time data collection. The golden goose really is probably a combination of that, so that real-time data collection, but coupled with proactive and preemptive flock health planning. So this is, I don't want there to be a lamb mortality issue. Where can let me look at my flock, identify the risks which might go on to challenge my lamb vigour in the lambing window, and let me address them now so I don't end up with an issue. Now, it's dealing with Mother Nature, that's not always possible, but there often are some key diseases, for example, body conditions, etc., where we really can have those preemptive influences. And no matter where you're starting on this journey, retrospective is a really, really good place to start, but the proactive is the end game. So as I've said, that's starting off with the post-mortems. This is a form that's available on AHDB's website. I believe there's some webinars and some YouTube videos as well. And this is a really nice form to work through. It's going to ask you some key questions which are going to prompt you and get you thinking in a particular direction about the information you should be getting from your lamb. I think it'll be some very experienced vets and shepherds in the audience. I think sometimes we do need to keep it simple. So go back to basics when we're doing these investigations. So what do our neonatal lambs need? Because we should almost be doing a checklist of that when we're considering our investigation. Ultimately, we need a fit ewe that's going into this lambing window, and I'll come back to the necessity for that in a moment. But she's also going to need to be well fed with essentially for lamb size and colostrum quality and production as well. We mustn't underestimate the importance of having an easy lambing either. Some fantastic work done out of Scotland looking at neonatal baby lambs and their play behaviours, and actually just don't underestimate how much a difficult lambing can affect lambs, and I'm sure we've all experienced that where they take longer to stand, etc. So we want an easy lambing. But ideal birth weight, a little bit like Goldilocks. Don't want to be too small and don't want to be too big. There's risks at either end of the spectrum, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And colostrum, spend a little bit of time in that in a second, but absolutely essential for neonatal lamb survival. Two other things which, depending whether you're indoor lambing or outdoor, a hygienic environment is going to be essential, because if you've got high bacterial load in lambing sheds on lamb equipment, that's going to be a real challenge for lamb survival and infection burden. And freedom from discomfort, one of the 5 freedoms. Sometimes we can't do an awful lot about Mother Nature, but have we put fit ewes in an environment, easy lambing, lots of colostrum with some access to shelter? I suggest that's probably reasonably important. Now, this is a slide that you will all be familiar with, and is arguably one of the most important parts of working with sheep flocks, which is essentially ewe body condition score. We know that in that last trimester of pregnancy, the ewes are working exceptionally hard. They're diverting resources to lamb growth, which, as we know, is metabolically draining, but crucially, udder development and colostral yield as well. I always find it really pertinent looking at this graph, where if we look in the changes in body condition score post-lambing, essentially when they're lactating, just reminds us actually how much hard work these girls have got to do post-lambing in order to get us the daily live weight gains and lamb growths that are ultimately essential for lamb production. So if we've got a ewe pre-lambing who's not in the right body condition score, well, we're potentially placing her at issues with poor colostrum, poor milk yield, etc. But are we committing her to excessive amounts of hard work post-lambing and potentially compromising that potential? So it does go full circle. So this is absolutely crucial. And this is a graph you'll also be familiar with. So that last third of pregnancy, just looking at that fetal growth, but absolutely not forgetting that udder development. These are lactating animals, and that is imperative for our colostral development and also that forthcoming milk yield. And this was work produced by AHDAS, where they post-mortemed a collection of lambs and essentially looked for evidence of colostral transfer. So had these lambs had enough colostrum? And I think it's really telling, of all the lambs they post-mortemed in this project, 12% of them had adequate. So it's a real predictor of lamb mortality and really is liquid gold in the lambing shed. But just to re-emphasise why colostrum is incredibly important, is that essentially when our lambs are born, whether they're indoors or outdoors, our ticking time bomb or our clock starts ticking. And it starts ticking for 2 reasons. One, from an energy perspective. So this is a picture below of a lamb that I've post-mortemed. And this is his, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is his kidney. We've got brown fat on his kidney. And incidentally, this was a lamb that was born dead, so it was a single lamb, so that's a reasonable amount of brown fat around that kidney. And essentially, that's a little furnace providing energy for that lamb in the first 5 to 6 hours to give him or her the opportunity to find that colostrum. Now, most lambs won't need 5 to 6 hours, but this is the insurance policy for the lambs that perhaps struggle or find a delay, or where there's a delay. Now, ewes that are in poor body condition score are going, or rather small lambs, are going to have less brown fat and are potentially going to be more vulnerable to things like hypothermia. So we've got this ticking clock, this necessity to beat the brown fat clock as such, and colostrum is going to be that source of fat and proteins and vitamins, and it's exceptionally energy dense. So we need to get that colostrum in before that brown fat runs out. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a position of having hypothermic lambs and lambs more vulnerable to other diseases as well. But the second clock that is ticking once our lamb has been born is the immunoglobulin challenge, which is essentially the immune support for these lambs. So our neonatal lambs are born without a primed immune system, which means they are inherently vulnerable to lots of the pathogens that they experience in the lambing shed. Mother Nature at its best, the used colostrum is a phenomenal source of IgG in particular, and therefore provides protection for those lambs in the first week before their own immune system kick starts. We've got to remember that colostrum quality will decline very, very quickly in use. So that really good stuff when you first strip out a ewe in a couple of hours post-lambing, that is liquid gold. That's the food of life in your lambing shed. And that's incredibly dense with energy, but crucially, there's immunoglobulins. Our challenge is that we need to get that colostrum into that lamb before its gut pores start to close and it can't absorb any more IgG. Now, whilst that clock is not ticking quite as quickly as the brown fat one, it's often the solution that we get that colostrum in there quickly to achieve both of those aims. And they do need reasonable amounts of colostrum as well. So whilst the quality of the colostrum is going to be driven by ewe body condition score, etc., the quantity of colostrum is also going to be met by that as well. The other cue quickly is really, really important here, and I'm a big believer that this is something that it's something you can prepare for. So when you're making your culling decisions post-weaning and you let that ewe go back one more time in the flock and she's got pendulous udder, all those really hard work teats, make that a very conscious decision that potentially you're committing those lambs to taking longer to get that colostrum. And this is also a repeatable piece of work which I think really sums up for me the importance of ewe nutrition and pulling the whole picture together. So along the bottom, and this is some work from SRUC, earth weight of lambs and essentially their mortality, which is a U-shaped curve. We can see on the far left we've got high mortality in these very small lambs. It's going to be a factor of a couple of things. That's going to be small birth weight. It's going to make you more vulnerable to cold. Possibly also that you're a triplet and that you've had difficult lambing and you've had to be unknotted from your siblings. But equally, it's possibly that your mum's got poor body condition and that colostrum quality is a challenge. Or you're a small, weak lamb and you take longer to get to that colostrum. But got to look at the other end of that spectrum as well, these really big lambs as well, and there's a mortality challenge there. Now, that's largely going to be, they're probably nice big single lambs, and there's going to be a dystocia element there, so a difficult lambing element. So there's this real sweet point just under 3.5 to 5.5 kilos, where actually what you've probably got is a fit ewe, not too many siblings, so not pulling, and a ewe that's in good body condition score, and ultimately an easy lambing. So I'm just going to, hope there's nobody squeamish in the audience, just show you some things that we've sort of seen on post-mortems, which are really simple to decipher what the issue is on farm. So this is the head end of the lamb on the left, is his stomach and abdomen's on the right of the screen, and this is his chest, and they're broken ribs. So in this instance, we felt that it was likely to be related to dystocia, so a difficult lambing, and possibly should have been a candidate for caesarean, or that there was an issue on farm with large lambs. And this is something else we see as well. This is a big top lamb. If I just scoot along to the next image, he's had an issue there with liver rupture, probably as part of the same reason. And this is another lamb, and this is something we see quite often. So incidentally, this is a lamb that I think died in lambing when we post-mortemed him, but just to show you a couple of the key things that we look for on post-mortem. Although I haven't made it, this is his stomach here on the left-hand side of the screen. I hope you can see my mouse. And you might not believe me, but if I make a little nick in there, that's going to be empty, so there's not going to be any evidence of milk in there. So if this was an older lamb, I'd be worried that perhaps there was an issue with starvation there. Basically, he'd run out of time. But we can see that there's lots of lovely brown fat there around that kidney, which is indicative that he's less. And this is a lamb that had an issue in lambing. And just to remember, there's always the weird and wonderful ones, and send a picture to your vet anyway, because everyone always appreciates them for our libraries. But I just wanted to show you just some examples. This was a part of a project that we did with AHDB, and what I just want to demonstrate is the necessity to get flock specific data. So These are pie charts of the causes of deaths on a series of farms that we work for. And even without looking at the causes of death along the bottom, you can see from the pie charts that the causes of death are different. This is an outdoor lambing flock. They had bigger issues with hypothermia and starvation outside, whereas the indoor lambing flock, there's a few dystocia-related issues, but also watery mouth started featuring on there. The other thing I would advise you to look at, and this is why I really encourage flocks, if they can, to do as much proactive screening of lamb mortality as possible, is if you're a flock of 1,000 and you're 1,800 lambs a year and I only post-mortem 6 of them, how reliable is that 6 lambs? How representative is that of your whole lamb mortality issue on farm? The more lambs I do, the more reflective it's going to be of what's actually happening. So that proactive strategy is going to be really important there. The particular cause of lamb mortality that I wanted to take the time to sort of pull out and specify was about watery mouth, because it's this time of year, particularly for our March-April lambing flocks, where I'm starting to have lots of discussions about watery mouth. Watery mouth is essentially an E. coli, it's a bacterial infection in neonatal baby lambs. And if you remember what I said earlier about the pores in the guts, and the guts being essential for all that immunoglobulin traffic and that immunity provision, we essentially have lambs where the first thing that they swallow is feces in a lambing pen, sucking on mum's teats, and they're covered in, and they're highly contaminated. Actually, the first thing that hits those small intestines is pathogens. And if we've got a lamb that isn't immunocompetent, as they all are, they're all naive when they're born, we potentially have a very, very vulnerable individual, and we can very, very see how quickly that situation will deteriorate. I'm a big believer that colostrum is one of the biggest drivers of a successful watery mouth issue, managing watery mouth in farm, because actually it's going to provide that IgG, that protection, that energy, that immune system, and it's absolutely essential. And we see bigger challenges with watery mouth when there's another reason for colostrum being an issue. So, for example, the ewes are too thin, it's chronic or managed fluke, there's been an issue with feeding. Watery mouth is the barometer for what's previously happened, and in that situation it may be necessary to seek alternative strategies for management. But ultimately, if you're worried about watery mouth, or you have an issue in your lambing shed, it needs investigating. Now, whilst antibiotics are probably most definitely important to manage, especially if you've got sick animals, it's important that alongside that we're investigating actually why we're ending up in that position. And as vets, there's a few key tests that we can do. So is it quality of colostrum that's a problem? Have we got poor ewes? Is it a feeding issue? Well, we're going to get clues from that based on, we can use things like Brix refractometer. It's very cheap, very easy to do, looking at colostrum density. Quantity of colostrum, that might be your post-mortems that might give you an indicator for that, or assessing how much milk ewes have at that first feed, or how full lambs are by 6 hours old. But to assess sort of all 3 of those things on the quick thing, we can do blood tests in lambs, which aren't expensive to do, and just offer a quick check that actually that's not the issue. That's not the issue for predisposing to watery mouth, and ZSTs are typically the test that we do. Antibiotics most certainly might have a role, and that's something that you need to speak to your own private practitioner about. But going forward, we need to think about all the other things that are playing a role in the background. And just one final word on watery mouth. Remember that your tube feeding equipment, whether it's the stomach tube, whether it's bottles, they're potentially sources of bacteria. And I have plenty of flocks that have them in sterilising equipment or keeping them as clean as possible. And that's absolutely essential. And just to remind you, really, this is a report that was produced, it's produced annually, but this is the 2004 report. I don't really need to worry about the intricate details, but essentially these are E. coli isolates from baby lambs that have been submitted through the government labs, and basically they expose those bacteria to antibiotics that are essentially available on the shelf. And all I need you to notice is that there's the dark brown components of those bars are resistant element, or those bacteria are resistant to those. So we need to be thinking longer term about strategies that don't entirely rely on antibiotics, thinking outside the box, and watery mouth and ewe nutrition is ultimately a key starting point for that. And just in sort of the closing stages of this webinar, just to reiterate a few key points. So lots of bright coloured boxes. When we're looking at ewe mortality, I really like it as a starting point for discussion with my shepherds or with other vets, because actually it really is a KPI where any other area of flock health potentially can negatively or positively impact on it. So, for example, if you've got a lameness issue in your sheep flock, that's going to depress body condition score. And we've said this evening about how body condition score is going to affect lamb size, colostrum quality, colostrum availability, and that's going to influence lamb mortality issues. And the same applies for chronic liver fluke or sheep scab. It's going to suppress those body condition scores. Yonies, Medivisner, issues with nutrition, all of those are going to suppress body condition score, and that's going to be a really key driver of lamb survival. Equally, infectious abortion is going to suppress both the actual number of lambs that get out, that survive to the point of being born, but equally it's going to suppress lamb thrift in the lambing shed as well. So that's essential to have that discussion with your flock health advisor and potentially evaluate the risk for your flocks. But I think one of the things that's really essential, and why when we have an issue, for example, with watery mouth, why we think about the bigger picture, because ultimately, largely, if you've got a challenge with something like watery mouth or small lambs or issues with lamb mortality, the risk factors for those, so for example, poor body condition score in ewes, are potentially going to translate into the performance we see over the next phase. So if you've got thin ewes, it's going to suppress lactational yield, drops in those growth rates, and actually we're doing a disservice if we're not having that discussion about actually what is our watery mouth issue telling us about our flock, and is there something that we could be doing differently, working together as shepherds, vets and advisors to have a long-term benefit for that flock. And that's essential that we do have those discussions. So in summary points, and a reminder for anybody that's tweeting, it can be costly, lamb mortality, and really I would encourage you to think about it as lost potential. You've invested in those ewes at scanning, and actually mortality is a loss of that investment. But the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure, and measuring doesn't have to be complicated or challenging in year one. Sometimes those big headline figures might just focus your attention for next year or focus your recording, and actually that can be really valuable when investigating it. You'll hear lots of advisors say that lambing is predetermined long before the actual lambing happens, and I think body condition score and culling are two classic examples of that. Ewes too thin, going to the tup, are going to really struggle largely throughout the rest of that production period. So preparation and forward planning is essential, and equally the ewe that goes back into the tup with her udder below her hocks, she's just asking for trouble in your lambing shed. To reiterate, body condition score, body condition score, body condition score. And although I anticipate most of the flocks in the audience are going into lambing now, and that's probably all you guys can think about, but going forward, are you sowing the seeds about your weaning practices? You might not be doing anything about it, but what's your plan and what for weaning going forward? Feeding the ewe is absolutely essential, and it should be based on forage analysis and looking at the needs of those scanned ewes, and it's going to impact colostrum quality, lamb survival, and ultimately growth from milk. And finally, get your vet involved with proactive health planning. Prevention is going to be cheaper than that lost potential, and like I said earlier, something like a watery mouth issue is largely going to be a barometer for other issues that are happening in your flock, and managing or investigating lamb mortality probably will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that was the last point. And there's just some key references here. The AHDB manuals are one of my go-tos, particularly for vets and for farmers. Some fantastic information in those. The AHDB flock notebook, and there's a couple of other references there. Just good things to have in your office for a rainy day. Thank you.